السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. I'd like to welcome you all back to Afkar al-Alim, Thoughts of the World. I'm your host, Abu Amran, and today we wanted to talk about something that is a very important topic, and it's kind of a sad topic, but it's something that we can learn from. And so it has to do with an injustice that took place, and but it is something that is very uh, uh, prevalent, an issue that is very prevalent within the American society, within the American civilization. And so it's something that needs to be talked about. And as usual, we'll provide an Islamic perspective on this particular issue. And so this um, issue that we're talking about, we wanted to make a video about a terrorist attack that took place in the United States. During that time, there were many other attacks that took place, but this one is, uh, I guess, the subject of today, if you will, because there are some current significant players in this particular attack that took place. And this attack took place in Tulsa in 1921. And at that time, Tulsa was a growing, prosperous city fueled by oil money. And the population of that city was around 100,000 people. And with that population, about 10,000 were African Americans, and they resided and lived in a neighborhood called Greenwood. And it was basically a section of Tulsa. And Tulsa at the time was very socially was highly racially segregated city, as were most, if not all, of the cities at the time. So there was, a white section, and there was a section for what they called the colored or Negroes at the time that they lived in, and it was usually, not too far away from the rest of the city, but it was definitely segregated. But Tulsa or Greenwood was unique at this time because it had a very thriving business district. And this area was referred to as the Black Wall Street. And on May 30th, 1921, a young man named Dick Rowland was riding an elevator in the Drexel building with a white woman at the time, and her name was Sarah Page. And the details related to their encounter are sketchy, but it appears that Rowland accidentally bumped into Page, exiting the elevator, and probably stepped on her foot. And as a result, she yelled out. And so then Rowland, understanding the significance of making this type of mistake, he ran away. And so, with the potential of potentially being lynched for, making this type of mistake, of course, the natural thing to do is run away because at that time, justice for African Americans was virtually non-existent, and the people were very quick to lynch, especially, well, not just African American men, but African American women and children, especially when it came to interactions or accidental, in many cases, interactions with white women. So the Tulsa police arrested Rowland the following day and began an investigation. And as a result of that, some Black World War I veterans were concerned about his safety, so they showed up at the courthouse for protection for Rowland. And a provocative report in the Tulsa Tribune the next day led to a confrontation between black and white mobs. And so shots were fired. And then there was, obviously an altercation between the two groups. And the outnumbered African American group retreated to the Greenwood district. And as a result of that, on June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was burned to the ground by the white mobs. And the governor then declared, or during that time, he declared martial law, and the National Guard troops were deployed, and the guardsmen assisted the fire brigade in putting out the fires, but the white mobs threatened them. And so the Greenwood district was allowed to be burned to the ground, and over 6,000 Black residents were imprisoned in a local fairground. So their neighborhood was attacked and by this mob, and they were basically their neighborhood was destroyed. And as a result of this, the residents of that area were imprisoned in fairgrounds as a result of this the white mob. So the white mob wasn't in prison, or they weren't held responsible for that at all. But the residents in this Greenwood town or Greenwood section of the city were basically in prison for basically just being Black in Greenwood at that time. And so the thugs, the white thugs at that time, caused about 35 blocks of charred ruins. So they had completely destroyed this entire section of the city. And according to later Red Cross estimates, some 1,256 houses were burned, 250 others were looted, but not torched, and 2 newspapers, a school, a library, a hospital, churches, hotels, stores, and many other Black-owned businesses were among the buildings destroyed and damaged by the fires. In the hours after the Tulsa riot, which is what this was called, all charges against Dick Rowland were dropped, incidentally. And so the police had concluded that Rowland had most likely stumbled into Paige or stepped on her foot. And so he was kept in safety under guard in the jail during the riot. And he left Tulsa the next morning and reportedly had never returned. So this whole incident, because initially when when the two mobs, the Black mob and the white mob, when they initially went to the courthouse to check on Rowland, of course, there were many rumors going about that the man had raped the girl, had assaulted the girl, what have you. And so there had never been, a trial about this. But the newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, had, just reported that this was, a provocative report as to what had happened irresponsibly, and, led to this. And so, and the mob wasn't interested in any type of trial, whatever, for this anyway, because, Black men, were routinely lynched for accidentally bumping into white women or walking on this next to them on the sidewalks and so forth. So this was clearly a lynchable offense regardless in their minds, and so by history standards. And so the Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics recorded that there were 36 deaths, but in 2001 the state commission examination of events was able to confirm that 36 dead and 26 Blacks and 10 whites. And so, however, historical evidence estimates that there were about 300 deaths. So there was an attempt to minimize this, the actual numbers of the dead, and of course to equate the number of white deaths close to the number of Black deaths, because, in years to come, they wanted to make sure that this didn't look as bad as it actually was. And so but more recent uh, events and investigations have proven that the small numbers, the 36 versus 10 was just, or excuse me, 26 to 10 was just an unreasonable amount due to the fact that they also have found mass graves and so forth about the people, the victims of the Greenwood victims who suffered from this terrorist attack. And in years to come, the Black Tulsans worked to rebuild their ruined businesses and in the segregated section of the city. But unfortunately, the Oklahoma had recently established the KKK group, and they began to develop a lot of strength. And so their efforts were, to no avail. And so they unfortunately were, terrorized. Additionally, with this this up and coming terrorist group, KKK, and so they were never able to reach their previous success that this section of the city actually had. For decades, and after that, there was no public ceremonies or memorials for the dead in an effort to commemorate the events that took place in 1921. Instead, there was a deliberate effort to cover this up. So before recently, you could ask individuals from Tulsa if they had heard about this, and many had grown up in Oklahoma and had never heard about the events that took place in Greenwood. And so the Tulsa Tribune removed the front page story from May 31st that sparked the chaos from the bound volumes. And scholars later discovered the police and the state militia archives about the riots that were missing as well. And so there was clearly a state cover up to try to hide this event that happened in history. And we've seen this oftentimes, because when there is discussion, sensitive topics, a very sensitive topic to talk about slavery, reparations, Jim Crow, even events that took place during Reconstruction. So oftentimes it's a part of the culture not to talk about these things or to be annoyed whenever they're discussed, because people don't like to talk about these evil events that their ancestors, and in some cases, when it comes to Jim Crow, that their grandparents, that the events that they actually did. And so they want to sweep these type of events under the rug and pretend that they never happened, or that the people that when they talk about them, they're just being provocative and troublemakers, and that they're exaggerating about the events that actually took place. And so also worth noting that the vast majority of Tulsan African American, the population, were made homeless by this atrocity. Yet, despite the efforts of the white establishment to force the relocation of the Black community within days of the violation of this particular attack, the Black Tulsans had already begun to try to rebuild their Greenwood community. However, they were forced to spend the winter in 1921 and 22 living in tents for many of them. And so the reason why this is important, a part of history, is that just recently there were 3 plaintiffs who were survivors of the Tulsa incident that had filed a lawsuit in the hopes of receiving some compensation for the torture that they had gone through at the hands of the mobs in Tulsa, in Oklahoma at that time. And so their names are Leslie Benningfield Randall, who's 108 years old, Viola Fletcher, who's 109, and her brother, Hughes Van Ellis, who's 102. And so their lawsuit was thrown out. And the judge who throughout their case. I have a picture of her. This is her. And so this is Judge Carolyn Wall. And on July 7th, that Friday, she dismissed the case, the prejudice, as she stated, dismissed the case with prejudice, of the lawsuit with prejudice, trying to force the city and others to compensate for the destruction of the once thriving Black district. So she felt that this was an unfair case, lawsuit, a frivolous lawsuit. And so by making this type of declaration, it made it unlikely that the plaintiffs would be able to reinitiate this lawsuit. Okay. And so this is a very important case in our history. And so what is it that, among other things, can we learn from this? That these evil events happened a long time ago, and the people affected by them are long gone. And so here was a case of some very old individuals who had suffered, that was during Jim Crow. And so they were still alive, or they are still alive, at least by the time this video was made, they're still alive. And there was an opportunity to compensate them for the pain that they had gone under. But clearly that the legal system decided against that, and they were not compensated. Also, the city of Tulsa clearly failed these individuals and showed the level it failed them with an attempt to, it could provide some compensation to these individuals, but it decided no, and it decided that they weren't going to do the right thing and make the situation right. And so decided that no, they weren't going to compensate these individuals. Okay. And it's important to note that the state of Oklahoma missed an opportunity to shine in front of the rest of the world and take responsibility for an evil atrocity, but they decided to just drop the ball and just hope that this thing would just go away. And that people would just stop talking about it. And so, but what's happening is that when these events like this happen, we begin to, or the United States loses credibility with the rest of the world, because we are known as the world, or this country is known as the world police. And they enjoy traveling around the world and mentioning their levels of morality and the importance of human rights and morality among other people. But then what happens is that these governments will throw incidents like this back in their faces and say, well, look, you don't even have morality or human decency, human rights towards your own people. So why is it that you're trying to teach us about morality and decency? Why don't you handle your own issues first and stop sweeping your own issues under the rug and stand up to and face the issues that you've done to your own people and address those? But instead, we don't seem to understand that the hypocrisy that exists there. There was a case that the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, it gave surviving Japanese Americans reparations and a formal apology from then President Reagan for incarcerating them during World War II. Now, one thing that is important to note about this, and it's a very strong note worth that we can learn from, is that the driving force behind the movement wasn't the desire to compensate the Asians who were unfairly detained during World War II. The reason that they were compensated was for economic reasons. And what I mean by that is that they understood, the United States understood the investment potential of the Asian community in the U.S. markets. And so this was done with the hopes of maintaining those dollars. And so it wasn't that they did this, with the desire to correct a wrong that had taken place. But they realized that if they publicize this and put this out there and compensate those remaining Japanese survivors of those internment camps, that would have a good effect with particularly Japan and later on China, but primarily Japan. And so in Japan investing their dollars in the American economy. And so that's all that was about. And so, in inverse of that, there's no gain or financial gain for compensating Black, uh, you know, centenarians, people who are over 100 years old. There's no financial benefit for that. I mean, their logic and thinking is that these individuals will be dead in a few years. And so there's no point and there's no financial gain in providing them some compensation for the torture that they had gone through. These people are already poor. Their money has already been, or their wealth has already been taken from them many years ago or whatever else. And so they have no wealth now. And so there's no one is going to fight for them. And we don't have any benefit in doing this. And so any financial benefit in doing this. And so we will just throw out their lawsuit and leave it at that. And this is how this society works. And so this is a very important thing for us to consider, that when we are seeking, rightfully so, seeking compensation for our ancestors who were enslaved in this country and who suffered under the enslavement and who suffered under Jim Crow and Reconstruction and who died and were murdered and treated unfairly because of redlining and for other time and forced discrimination and ill treatment in this country up until legalized until the 1960s, but took place in many cases, even into this day in some instances. And so if there is no financial compensation for something like this, then these acts will, or there's no financial gain for the government or for other, businesses, or smaller government entities to, if there's no gain for them, then there'll be no compensation for us. And so it's something to consider, because we have people alive today that suffered, directly, from a horrendous act and during Jim Crow, murder and, terrorism during their time, and they were clearly not compensated. And so from an Islamic perspective, of course, this is a great evil. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, he said, which means that the best among you are those in paying off their debt. And so the best among you are those in paying off their debt. And that this is reported in the collection of Muslim. And then procrastinating and repaying your debt of a wealthy person is an injustice. And so procrastinating and paying off your debt, this is an injustice. And this is reported in the collection of Bukhari. And so can you imagine the countless debt that this system has unpaid to so many different people? Okay. There's been some things given to the Native American people, but considering the theft that was done to them, they clearly haven't been paid enough. The African American people, the descendants of slavery that we spoke about in previous video, they were never compensated. Those people who lived under that were never compensated, and so their descendants are entitled to compensation for what their ancestors have gone through. And so we've seen from this that because of the evilness that is in the heart of the system that exists in this country, that there will never be any type of compensation, most likely, for the descendants of those people. Mention that to say that, again, the only thing that will save this country, is Islam, because it is the only thing that will rectify. We call that Islah, or bring rectification between the damage that uh, slavery and racism has caused in this country is Islam. That's the only thing that will fix this. And so that's the end of this particular